So hello everyone on Disability Horizons magazine. We're really excited to have the amazing Tanni Thompson on today's interview. Thank you for joining us, Tanni.
Thank you.
I believe you're in London at the moment, is that right?
I am. I'm actually at UK Active, which is a not-for-profit which I chair, and what we aim to do is get more people more active more often. Cradle's great, whether you're disabled, non-disabled. We want to encourage people to be active, to have a long and happy life, really.
Brilliant. Sounds very good, and we'll sort of explore into that a little bit more as the interview progresses. But I mean, as always, I just say to our guests, a bit of background. I think everyone watching is going to know so much about you, but if you give a little sort of bio and summary of who you are and where you come from.
So I'm Welsh. I'm from Cardiff. I grew up there. I went to university at Loughborough. I was an athlete for 20 odd years, competed at 5 Paralympics, won 11 golds, 4 silvers and a bronze.
Is that all?
Yeah, I should have tried a bit harder. And then for the last 7 years, since nearly 8 years, I've been in the House of Lords as an independent crossbench peer, working on physical activity sport and disability rights, which when I was competing was always a huge interest of mine, but it's I think difficult when you're competing to be involved in too many other things, and so for me retirement was a massive opportunity to move into a different field where I felt I could be kind of useful. I hope I feel useful.
So it sounds like you got to work on both of the passions that you'd always been interested in the long run. Around the Paralympic side, I mean, was that something that you were kind of growing up was an absolute thing you always wanted to do, or did it kind of come about more bit by bit?
I always wanted to compete.
Okay.
As a child, that I didn't really know too much about the Paralympics because it didn't have anywhere near the media coverage that it has now, which is good. But I was very sporty, grew up in a very sporty family. Participation across a whole range of sports was important to me. It wasn't just about being good at sport, it was about having fun, which is still really important to me. For my parents, I became a wheelchair user about the age of 7. It wasn't about a Paralympic pathway, it was about being fit and healthy enough to live in an inaccessible world, which it was back then because there were no drop curbs, no accessible toilets, absolutely no accessible transport. So, I started for different reasons, and then it kind of evolved into being an athlete and being an elite athlete. And then, retirement, and then into, as I get older, being physically active is even more important for me to have a life where I can live as independently as long as possible. So activity has always been there, and the disability rights side has always been there as well. That, I remember when I first heard about the social model, it was this wake up moment. It's like, it's not me then,
Yeah.
So understanding that and coming to it was massively important for my career as an athlete. And also it's really interested in athlete welfare, athlete rights. As an athlete, you don't have many rights. So it kind of is all linked up in different ways, actually. So I'm quite lucky it's all worked out in terms of what I get to do now.
That's really interesting. Before we moved a bit more into the right side of the discussion, when you were a Paralympian, how did you kind of feel and manage with the financial independence side? Because I can imagine certainly early on that must have been difficult to earn from doing something as much as you loved it, to have an income. And how did you work that out?
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't any money in disability sport back then, and there still isn't a huge amount now, apart from, a couple of athletes will be doing okay. The vast majority will be struggling. So, we have lottery funding, there is different levels of support that you can have. Actually, I was virtually a full-time athlete. I did other things while I was competing, which I think is actually important to have balance in your life. So I sat on the board of UK Sport Wales. I sat on the National Disability Council, which oversaw the implementation of the Disability Discrimination Act. So I kind of did lots of other things while I was competing that gave me a chance to earn money. And also when I retired, have other skills there, which kind of stepped in on retirement.
So I suppose, as you say, there was almost other types of work you were doing alongside the competing, but then as you became more successful, more high profile, I imagine there were some funds or sponsorships and things like that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was very lucky. I think living in Wales helped me a huge amount in terms of sponsors, which enabled me to do, I wouldn't say all the races I wanted to do, but it enabled me to do a lot of things, and also enabled me to be very practical in terms of training. And, you know, most the UK-based races I used to compete against the men's team because, you know, they were some of the best guys in the world. You know, they made me and helped me become a good athlete. So I don't think money is not always the answer to everything. It definitely helps, but I was lucky in terms of the support I got, and also being able to do other bits of work to make it work for me as an athlete.
Yeah, no, I think that would be very uplifting and inspiring for people that, you know, I think I always encourage our readers and listeners to do their passion, to really stick with what lights them up and what they enjoy. But obviously we've all got to make a living at the same time. So it's great to hear kind of how you balance those two. So, I mean, with the Paralympic years, what would you say your proudest moment was?
I mean, competing for GB is an amazing thing to be part of. And I was lucky I did 5 games. I think winning the 100 in Athens, which was my last Paralympics, where I wasn't expected to win, was a huge personal race for me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually other stuff along the way that I got to be involved in. So I got to be involved in the 2002 Commonwealth Games, and in terms of the inclusion that happened there, which helped us win the 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. So it's not always winning the gold medals on the track, although they're nice, but it's the other stuff that I had the opportunity to do on the back of it that made a difference to me. And being part of the bid and then working for the organising committee for 2012 was amazing. And the struggle and the challenge is that I don't think you can expect 10 days of a Paralympics to change the world for disabled people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we don't expect 2 weeks of an Olympics to change the world for the world. But it can kind of shift that dialogue and that discussion, and it can help. And I suppose, you know, the question I get asked all the time, you know, well, the Paralympics must have changed the world for disabled, but it hasn't. The vast majority of people, their life is no different. It was an amazing moment in time. It's probably changed the world for a lot of British Paralympians, but there's a whole pile of work we need to still keep doing to make sure disabled people have the same opportunities and rights to be part of an inclusive society.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I mean, one thing I have observed since the Paralympics, particularly London 2012, was there is more coverage about disability on the TV now. It feels like every week there's another program, but I totally hear and agree what you just said before about how the rights that we're all fighting for become a reality. So do you think that improvement with the media coverage is a step in the right direction at the moment?
It is a step in the right direction because, you know, you've got programs like Silent Witness with Liz Carr, and, you know, as a disabled actress, that's incredible because, you know, she's an actress. It's the whole storyline is not about her impairment and how it affects her and social things like that. So it's about normalising how disabled people are seen. I mean, the same way, you know, there are some Paralympians who have a very dramatic and traumatic story that led them to becoming a Paralympian. There's loads who don't. And, you know, just seeing disabled people on TV programmes in the media, just living their life without it being, you know, sensationalised, I think is really important because it allows another discussion about disability. Is it as good as it should be? No, it's not, because, you know, we still don't see disability represented in all its different facets. But it's better than it was. But I don't think we should be content to just sit where we are and just say, well, it's better than it was, so that's fine.
Yeah, totally.
We need to have disabled people reading the news. We need to have, you know, in all walks of life, we need to have more disabled people involved, because I worry that the voice of disabled people is lost in lots of parts of legislation and in lots of areas of work.
Yeah, but I suppose the only, well, not the only, the potential benefit of generally having more disabled people in the media, but the topic of disability covered as well, is awareness raising beyond our community. Because I know sometimes when we're doing what we do, there's a feeling of preaching to the converted. But then the downside, I suppose, is that some of the media coverage is not always the most positive. So you kind of want the right awareness going out to the masses, not the wrong message as well.
And it's, for me, language is important. It's about the right language. You still hear things like suffers from. I don't suffer from spina bifida. And it's the tone. Someone I know called David Proudest said to me years ago, language is the dress of thought. And he was absolutely right that, the language does impact on how people see you and perceive you. And, before Christmas, I couldn't get on a train and I tweeted it. It was a moment in time, something I spent less than a minute thinking about. And I don't know whether it's Christmas Eve or what it was, but suddenly all these people engaged in it and were wanting to write a news story, and everyone's getting very upset. And it was like, but this is something that happens to loads and loads of disabled people all the time. It happens to me quite regularly. And there were moments when it was good that people were interested, but this wasn't a one-off. And for me, it wasn't a news story because it had the regularity in terms of how it happens to people I know. So the danger with those moments is everyone's really upset for a day and a half. And then actually the way that disabled people physically access public transport is still not addressed. So that's the bit, is what do we do behind the scenes to go from the moment of outrage to, okay, what are we going to do to make sure disabled people can get on trains?
Yeah, and I presume that really does 100% bring us into your work at the moment, really, that it's, how can we not just have the Paralympics or TV shows, but have transport, work, everything else in everyday life be accessible and inclusive to everyone. So, I mean, how did you, because you became a Baroness, I saw on your Twitter, you're now Lady, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. So that's part of the title. I was always really interested in politics. I did politics at university. I never planned particularly to go into politics, but then through my time competing, it was something I became more and more interested in terms of how you can affect change through whether it's legislation or communication or lots of different ways you can bring about change. And then I had the opportunity to start the interview process to go in. And I was introduced in 2010. And I worked on a lot of the government legislation around 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games, things like road closures, Sunday trading, things that made the games happen. And then in 2011, 2012, the Welfare Reform Bill came along. And I remember the advice was, get a big bit of legislation and just sit and listen. And for me, it was like ideal because it was, it came to the heart of disability rights. And then when I started seeing all the paperwork that was coming and the briefing notes and the bill, it's like, I don't think I can just sit and listen. I know that's the advice I've been given, but I've got to say something. And so I spoke in the second reading, and then I had amendments, and then I was voting on amendments, and then it became a huge part of my year. So bizarrely, I'm doing Olympics and Paralympic Games on one hand, which is all very positive around disability and inclusion and accessible transport and making London a better place for disabled people. And then on the other hand, I'm doing the Welfare Reform Bill and then the Legal Aid Bill. So it was a huge baptism of fire for me in politics. But also for me, I think in terms of, at the time, there were a lot of peers who didn't do media interviews, and I started doing them. And one peer said to me, well, it's not our job to do interviews. And I said, well, I think it's our job to explain to people the potential changes that are coming. And you may agree or disagree with what those changes are and how to do them. But for me, it was important to not just sit back and shut up, but to give a view. And it's pretty hard going, losing votes. Sometimes you win a vote, but it get overturned when it go back to the Commons. And it's presenting the information in a way that people can make an informed decision about those the decisions we're taking in the chamber. Yeah,
I mean, and also reaching out of the houses to sort of, disabled people, the disabled community. At the moment, what do you feel the big sort of, I don't know if battle starts to sound too fighty, but they are battles at the end of the day. And really, how can people get involved and make a difference with their voice as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's still lots of challenges around personal independence payment, access to work, provision of wheelchairs. It's never ending. I mean, some change for a bit, and then you sometimes feel you're back to where you started. It's what works in the House of Lords is real people's experience. If you find a peer that works in an area that you're interested in, let them know. I mean, the challenge about being in the Lords is we don't have any staff. It's me. So when somebody writes to me and says, get a member of your staff to reply to me today, it's like, it's me at the computer.
Yeah,
that's a bit of a challenge. But write to your MP, let them know what's going on, and engage in social media. I still think it's great. I experience quite a lot of trolls, so that's not great, but that's part of what being in public life you have to unfortunately deal with. But let people know what you're going through, because that's the way. For us, it's about having that up-to-date information on how this legislation, if it goes through, will affect or is affecting people. And what I say to people is don't sit back, because we need those real people's experiences. There will always be challenges out there. There always will, but I think they can be less than they currently are.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, what we're doing with the D Horizons Tribe is trying to sort of bring people together, partly in the everyday give each other support way. But I think what you're saying is really empowering, that we start to feel like the democratic processes aren't really going to help us, that, the decisions are being made at the top and whatever we say or do isn't going to make a difference. But as you're pointing out, if you can get your MP or representative in the Lords to understand the real minutiae of an issue and the lived experience, it could sway the votes one way or the other.
It definitely does in the Lords, because although there are party affiliations, they're not as strong as in the Commons, and people will listen to the argument and will change their mind or vote or not vote. So it does make a difference, because also that there are quite often in bits of legislation unforeseen consequences, or bits of legislation that we don't really get to debate in as much detail. Even in welfare reform, there were implications of pensioners in there which we didn't really get to in enough detail, because you're having to pick and choose and prioritise which are the things you think you can change, or which are the things that will have the biggest negative impact on people. So for me, what's really important is disabled people's voice, and you get together and that shared community, and you find different ways of understanding it's not just you, that's affecting lots of other people. So anything that can bring disabled people together is really important. Yeah,
no, I like that. So last question, we're looking to the future. What's on the agenda for Tanni Thompson?
The gift that keeps giving for me coming up this year is the EU withdrawal bill. So regardless of whether, whatever your view on, Brexit or Remain, where we are now will have implications for disabled people. And I guess one of my concerns is that disability is something that doesn't get talked about. I mean, if you look back at any discussion on withdrawal from the EU, there was not really any talk about disability. There was very little talk about disability issues in the general election. It's not something in terms of politics that gets covered very much. So for me, that's a problem, that it slips off the radar. So I'm currently buried in hundreds of pages of notes and books and information to try and get my head around what the bill will mean, and where we can bring about change and hopefully protect the rights of disabled people, because it's important we don't lose any rights that disabled people currently have, but hopefully build on it and make them stronger.
What's really crazy about that, what you just said, is that if there's somewhere between 10 and 13 million, because I mean, that depends on which measurement statistics, but I think the latest was there's 13 million disabled people in the UK. So politically, if everyone united, that wouldn't just sway an election in a minor way, that would be a massive voter block. But I mean, I know when we've talked about in the past, the difficulty is trying to unify different parts of the disability community. But it just feels like that's got to be an objective going forward to come together and make sure this is tabled more often.
Yeah, absolutely, because we're not one homogenous group, and even someone with the same condition as I have will have a different lived experience, but it's how we can come together for kind of the greater good.
Yeah.
And on some big issues, not on everything, but that voice of disabled people is huge and is significant. And if you look at the spending power, you just look across all of it. It's a voice collectively that gets a bit forgotten. And me and my other colleagues in the Lords that work in this area are really keen that disabled people are protected. That sort of discussion isn't just something that happens at the end of the day. It's part of every single part of the withdrawal bill.
Yeah, well, if we can help in any way, let us know, Tanni.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
On that one.
Yeah, and thank you for your time today. It was great to catch up.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.